Well, thank you all for coming. Back in Macau, 16th year of the festival, which is sort of amazing. It's my great pleasure to moderate this session with the biographer Adam Sisman, who has written many biographies. You'll probably have read the program, but of everyone from Boswell to Hugh Trevor Roper, who I know people in this part of the world may know for his biography of Sir Edmund Backhouse, the Hermit of Peking. He has just published a biography of the Victorianist academic, political activist Asa Briggs, that many people will know if you're about my age and did history at university. And of course, most famously, and what we're going to talk about today, John le Carré. John le Carré. We did this. We did a version of this yesterday in Hong Kong, so we're kind of back again. And I warn you, hopefully, that we're going to talk about John le Carré and how you write a biography of someone who's alive when you're writing it, which is quite a different process to writing a biography of a person who's long gone. And we're also probably going to circle around and talk a little bit about an obsession of mine, but I know you like it as well. Le Carré is the honourable schoolboy, which of course is, for Le Carré fans in this part of the world, the magnum opus of the Le Carré world. And when they all go on about Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and all the others, you're just like, no, it's all about honourable schoolboy. That's the key text. So we'll probably talk about that for a bit. There'll be some time for Q&A. There's books on sale. We've got to be done by 4 o'clock because someone else is coming in. So we'll just get going. So thank you very much to Adam for coming over. Yeah. And perhaps, Adam, you could talk for a little bit about the genesis of this project and the mechanics of doing this biography of Le Carré.
Yes, certainly. Well, the genesis of the project, actually it had a sort of prehistory. The prehistory was that my late wife, Robin, was a publisher, and something like about 25 years ago, she came home one evening and said, I've just signed up Robert Harris to write a biography of John le Carré. And I said, well, I'd like to write a biography of John le Carré. And she said, tough. Over the years, every time I saw Robert Harris, I would say to him, how are you getting on with that biography of John le Carré? And he would say, well, I'm not really making much progress. Of course, he was making lots of money from his best-selling thrillers, much too much money to waste time writing a serious biography. And eventually, I think it must have been in about sometime in 2009 or 2010, we met for lunch in a pub, and he said that he decided to lay it aside. He encouraged me to write to Le Carré and, as it were, throw my hat into the ring, which is what I did. I wrote to Le Carré, footnote, piece of nomenclature. One of the things about John le Carré is it's a pseudonym. His real name is David Cornwall, or was David Cornwall, and so I kind of oscillate between the two. Talking about the person, I'm usually referring to him as David. Talking about the writer, I tend to refer to him as Le Carré. Anyway, I wrote to David and got a very long and courteous letter back saying, come and see me. And we met. It was very enjoyable. He pointed out various difficulties, but said they could be overcome. He agreed with me that what was needed was an objective, arm's-length biography, which would not attempt to gloss over unfortunate aspects of his life. And so, after a bit of negotiation, we proceeded. He gave me a list of friends and enemies with contact details, and in due course, I went down to his house in Cornwall, where his archive was kept, and began working there. So, at the start, everything seemed very promising.
Yeah, at the start. Okay, that's a setup, isn't it? Really, because I can only imagine that writing a biography of any living person and then writing one of someone famous and someone who perhaps had a little bit of a reputation for being slightly prickly and slightly kind of prone to studying himself, right, and wanting to present himself in a certain way, presents you a biography because you don't want to just get his received opinion of himself, right? You've got to get that from him and then sort of work out what's the truth of the man.
Absolutely. I mean, as time proceeded, there were sort of various sort of warning moments. He would say things like, I know it's supposed to be warts and all, but it seems to be all warts and no all. Why is it that you believe other people and don't necessarily believe me? To which I answered rather rudely, it's because you're a liar, David. And I said, I was quoting from him. He said he'd written that I am a liar. But I mean that actually in a respectful sense, not he, as a fabricator and as someone who, this is one reason why I thought he was an interesting subject for a biography. Not only because he'd had a very interesting life, but also because he'd constantly drawn on that life in his fiction, and in doing so had, as it were, reinvented himself again and again and again. And my job, as it were, was to peel back the layers and get behind all those layers of invention. Sometimes, I tend to think we all do this to some extent. We all kind of are writing our own histories and to try and make sense of our presence. And sometimes in doing so we distort our history. But I just think David did it more than most, partly because he was a novelist and had a very active imagination, and in that imaginative reconstruction of his life, he often altered the details, and sometimes more than the details. So, but it was also true that there were aspects of his life, like everybody's life, that he might not have wanted displayed in public. And he's not alone in this. I doubt if there are many of us who would want our lives displayed in public. I hadn't really, I have to confess, thought through the issues of writing about a living person, especially a living person who was complicated, manipulative, powerful, including power with publishers, and rich, and of course could easily have. He was a kind of dreadnought, and I was a minesweeper, or some junk perhaps. I could easily have been blown out of the water had he chosen to do so. And one of the problems that started to happen, not the only one, but one of the problems was that I began to realize that he had been persistently unfaithful to his first wife and then to his second wife. And I kept tripping over mistresses, you might say. I remember on one occasion I decided I should always be perfectly honest with David, and I said to him, I've met so-and-so, and his reaction was, oh no! And you may say, well, isn't this just tawdry tittle-tattle? And to some extent it was. But I came to realize that it was also part of his makeup, and also a theme of his writing was betrayal, infidelity, lying, and deceit. And that there was an analogy between his personal life and the subjects that he wrote about. In some ways it went deeper than that. One of his mistresses told me, well, it's actually more than one of his mistresses told me that they felt as if they were being run like an agent, that he was their agent runner. He conducted his personal life as if he was a spy master. Anyway, that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, because we come to that. But things thunderclouds began to build on the horizon, and our relations began to get more strained as time went on, as I worked on through the book. And I did attempt always to write an objective, respectful but objective biography. The idea was that it would be a full biography, and that I would try and help explain the man, not least to explain him to himself. I think that was, for David, that was part of the attraction, but also the danger of the project.
And writing a biography of a living person, not only do you have to deal with them, warts and all, but they then read it. When they can walk into a bookshop, buy it and read it. What was his feedback?
Well, it was before it was in a bookshop. I mean, we had agreed, there were really two conditions, perhaps three conditions that he made at the outset. One was that he would be the first person to read it. And comment on it, and that I didn't necessarily have to accept his comments, but that I would give them due and serious consideration. A second was that I would endeavour to make sure that everything in the book was factually accurate. And the third was that I would pay attention to the sensitivities of living parties, which is actually a trickier thing to achieve than you might, than appears on the surface. I mean, does that include him, for example? But at the same time, I recognise that, you know, for him to agree to a biography being written in his lifetime, in the lifetime of his wife, his children, and all the people who are closest to him, was a difficult project, and people don't necessarily want their personal lives and their pasts displayed for all and sundry to read for a very modest price in the bookshop. That, you know, and one of the problems about writing, about knowing your subject, is that you begin to form a personal relationship with them. You have feelings of maybe affection, of gratitude.
This is also part of running an agent, right? Building
yes,
that relationship.
It is, but it's also part of, as soon as we kind of go to somebody, we go into their house, we accept a glass of something or other, we sit down and eat a meal with them, we set up a dynamic which means that you're not necessarily totally objective. And so I tried to stay, I mean, both of us were sort of tiptoeing around each other. I remember when he had his 80th birthday celebrations, he said, "I thought about inviting you, Adam, but then I thought that might be a bit creepy." And I rather agreed with him about that. I mean, I should say that although things became tense between us, we did have a lot of laughs as well. I mean, he could be very entertaining.
I'm going to assume that everybody here is reasonably, at least, familiar with the writing of John le Carré, and if not, you're probably having quite a random, bizarre Saturday afternoon if you have no idea who we're talking about. But I mean, in your view, as the biographer of him, and it's I mean, we'll come on to this book, but it's a chunky biography, and you had been a reader of him before. What makes him sort of, you know, the gold standard of espionage writing, but also such a sort of master stylist as well? What do you think his secret was?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer. I would just assert that he is the gold standard. I think he raised spy writing to a new level. I mean, when he had his breakout book, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, I mean, this was instantly recognized by reviewers. They said, you know, forget about James Bond, this is the real thing. This is, not only is it, I mean, Graham Greene, without knowing who John le Carré was, described it as the best spy story I have ever read, which is quite a good puff, isn't it? And in a way it's better than the spy story. His best books, not all his books, but his best books, I think do transcend the spy story genre. They are serious novels. I mean, Philip Roth described A Perfect Spy, his autobiographical novel, as the best English novel since the war, full stop. And you can argue about that, of course, but it's some praise, isn't it, from a master novelist himself. And I mean, the reason why I set about wanting to write about John le Carré is because I was a great admirer of his best books. I think some of his later books are not nearly so good. But then I always think that for any writer, you judge them by their best books, not by their worst books. What we haven't talked about, though, is the crisis in our relations and the relationship of this book to the previous book.
Don't worry, we'll get there.
Okay,
we'll get there.
Okay.
But I'm interested in, just for a second, to talk about him as a writer and also how you approach that, because I'm trying to think of, one of the fascinating things about le Carré's career is, and of course now, when these books were published, they were contemporary fiction, right? But when we read something like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy or The Honourable Schoolboy now, we're reading historical fiction when we pick it up now, when new readers come to him. I can't think of another writer who kind of lost their core subject in such a spectacular way. You know, I mean, one day the Soviet Union's there, the next it's not, and then he has to reinvent his career. And I wondered if that's something you spent time talking about.
Yes, well, he had talked about it before I came along. Yes, I mean, I think he has a very good claim to be regarded as the definitive novelist of the Cold War. I mean, I know that's a big claim, but really, who else is there who begins to compare with him? And in that, he explored the Cold War from every facet. But also he is somebody cleverer than me described him as the laureate of Britain's post-imperial sleepwalk, and I think that's a neat way of. I mean, a lot of the emotion that underlies his books is that coming to terms with Britain's much diminished role in this part of the world and indeed throughout the world, and the difficulties that people felt in adjusting to that, and in particular in adjusting to a much diminished role vis-a-vis America, the cousins, as he calls them. One of his trademarks is the terminology that he uses, which so many different. I mean, he was the one who first popularized the term mole to describe an agent who burrows into the deep into the core of the enemy, whoever the enemy may be, but met so many other evocative terms: pavement artists, lamplighters, etc., etc., tradecraft. These terms are so useful and so appropriate that they have actually been adopted, so I'm told, by those who know better than me, by intelligence services, not just in Britain but also in the US and elsewhere. So that in itself is a kind of tribute. I think there's a third element that makes him, though, third or fourth element. I mean, the one element is his exploration of the human heart. He digs deep into certain kinds of emotion. I mean, betrayal is a key subject in his books, and the sense of betraying yourself when you betray others, and loyalty, but loyalty to whom? Loyalty to your country, loyalty to your friends, and sometimes loyalty to your partner, and the conflicts that may arise between these. And one other element I would highlight about him is, I think, he is a fine stylist. Particularly, he is has a wonderful ear for dialogue, and I think I have a theory which I advance in my book, that a lot of this arises from the fact that he was a brilliant mimic and indeed an actor. One of the ways in which he used to write was he would go for walks with a little notebook, and he'd be muttering to himself lines of dialogue, and he'd adjust them, turn them over, rather like an actor. Often, film actors and stage actors to some extent modify the text that they're given, perhaps not Shakespeare, but more modern texts, into forms that seemed to them more appropriate. So he would do that until he was satisfied, and then he would stop and scribble down that text. And so he could hear very much the lines that he was writing. And that's why the dialogue, I think he had a particularly good ear actually for people speaking in English for whom English was not their first language, Germans, Russians, Hungarians, whatever they might happen to be, and indeed Americans, you might say. We were talking earlier about meet and meet with, and Smiley questioning the use of the cousins. Yeah. Having
it's in Honourable Schoolboy.
It's in Honourable
where
Schoolboy.
Gwilym says to Philby, "The Americans want to meet with you."
Not Philby.
Sorry, not Philby.
Smiley.
Smiley, sorry. Says the Americans want to meet with you, and Smiley is just like, "Really?" They said meet with you, and Gwilym's just like, "Yes." And Smiley sort of goes off on a musing. Really? I mean, it must be the German influence to say that, because of course, English would say to meet, just to meet is sufficient. So yeah, as I like Smiley, of course, he was a German linguist, wasn't he?
He was more than a German linguist. I mean, German friends told me how he could tell funny stories in German, putting on different accents, imitating, for example, uneducated rural Germans, sophisticated urban Germans, the rather inadequate German of the British ambassador, and have them rolling around in tears of laughter at these stories that he would tell. After all, in a language which was not his first language, he was an excellent linguist. He studied modern languages as a student at Oxford, and later taught modern languages immediately afterwards at Eton.
Yeah. And had been stationed in Bonn with the intelligence services as well.
Yes, I mean that's part of his. He did have a career in intelligence. First of all with MI5, and then later he transferred to MI6, which is useful training for a spy writer.
Yeah. So trust, loyalty, deceit. These are all themes that run through all of his books he's exploring, which sort of explains why you've got one very thick biography of him, and then after his death came the book you see here, The Secret Life, which could only be published at that point. I mean, can you talk about what that strange situation was?
Yes, well, I alluded earlier to strained relations between us, and they became. I began to get agonizing letters from David saying, "I don't know if we can go on like this, and we're becoming increasingly anxious about what you're going to write." And at one stage, he proposed that I publish the book in 2 volumes. The first volume ending in 1979, I think he suggested, and the second volume being published posthumously. And things reached such a point that his son, his oldest son Simon, acted as an intermediary and came down to visit me at my house in Bristol, and we spent a day together. And Simon proposed a compromise, which was that I should keep a secret annex of material that was difficult to publish in David and his wife Jane's lifetime for posthumous publication. And that's the compromise we agreed on. So the big book, which isn't on display here, but I hope will be upstairs, is a full biography, but there is a secret life. There are other details, particularly of his personal life, which are in this little posthumously published book. I mean, I should say this is 2 things. This is not just the dirt. It's more than that. If it was just the dirt, it might be the kind of thing you might be embarrassed to read. But it's also, as his friend Nicholas Shakespeare said to me, the most interesting relationship in this book is not between David and any of his mistresses, but it's between you and David. And this is the story behind the story. It's the story of writing the book, and the tensions and the kind of it's so in a way it's a study of the limitations of biography. I start by talking about Janet Malcolm's idea of the biographer peering through the keyhole into the bedroom. And I describe myself as not like that kind of biographer at all, but the kind of biographer who clears his throat loudly in the corridor outside, and then knocks on the door and waits to be admitted. I didn't want. I don't think sleaze in itself is very interesting, but I did come to the conclusion that not only was David's personal life worth talking about, but it was actually key to understanding his nature and his writing. He seemed to need the jeopardy, the risk, and the excitement of having a clandestine life in order to fuel his creative imagination. Of course, some of this, to some extent, might have been an excuse, but he really did seem to need that. The life of a writer, I can speak from personal experience here, is not a very exciting one, except on the rare occasions when you get invited to exciting places like this. But generally speaking, we just sit at home and bash away at our computers, so having had an exciting life, early life working for MI5 and MI6, he maybe needed something to spice up his middle age.
But I mean, it's worth thinking about his relationships a little bit. I mean, apart from the fact that we can trace some of the origins of some of his characters, which we can talk about, but they're not necessarily. I mean, they're slightly strange relationships. I mean, some of them are really kind of. I don't know how to describe them really, but as you know, the one he had with the American woman, for instance, is sort of interesting.
Yes, I mean, in a way, it's very revealing well, let me tell the story of his relationship with the American woman. A woman wrote him a fan letter, a woman in sort of early middle age who was going through a difficult time in her own marriage, as it turned out. But she wrote him a fan letter saying how much she'd enjoyed. I think she'd seen him actually on television before she'd read anything of his, on the Charlie Rose show. In fact, yes. He wrote back, and then she wrote to him again. And very quickly, this correspondence became intensely personal, so that by about the third or fourth letter, he was fantasizing about her naked. At this point, she perhaps rather tactfully sent him a photograph, which made it clear that she was a woman of colour, which he perhaps hadn't been aware of before. Anyway, the letters continued to become more and more personal, and pretty soon he was talking about leaving his wife, and for them making a life together, writing books together. She too had literary ambitions. At this stage, they hadn't met. They'd never seen each other. They'd not even been on the same continent. He was saying, "I need you. Without you, I can't write." And talking a lot about what he was writing and how she had given him this new impetus. They did eventually spend one night together. This was a relationship that lasted, if it was a relationship, 2 years, and which did put his marriage in jeopardy. And eventually his wife did find out about it, and she was very angry indeed. What a risk to take for one night. I mean, let's hope it was a good night, because it seems rather unbalanced. But I think it was, as I say, I think it was the jeopardy, the excitement, the idea, the secrecy as well. Secrecy is part of course, spying, and he was in a way playing at being spying. He could no longer really spy, but he was acting out his own clandestine story with another person in secret.
I mean, the end of that story, and the end of a couple of these stories, is he develops relationships with these women, and then at a certain point he just backs away from them and says, "Oh, well, that's the end of that. I'm now off back to my wife." And there's almost like a streak of cruelty in that, which in some of his characters there's a streak of cruelty as well, including Smiley. That sometimes decisions have to be made that are that can appear cruel, but in the greater good. I mean, it's not a very endearing trait, that, is it, to lead someone on all the way and then just decide to back off from them?
It's an absolutely appalling trait. I mean, I think he was a damaged human being, and this was a terrible way to behave, not just to the mistresses, but also to his wife. I mean, it involved a life of deceit and a manipulation. And he would just drop them, actually. I mean, he dropped them just like that. After, almost in the same breath, saying, "I'm going to run away with you, we're going to spend the rest of our lives together," he'd say, "Oh, actually, I've decided I don't want to see you again." Yeah, I mean, it's as if... And he liked to quote something that Graham Greene apparently had said to him, is, "You need a new woman for every book," which seems a pretty crude way of approaching it. But
to be fair, Greene went with the same affair through quite a lot of books, didn't he?
Yes.
He didn't.
Well, did he? He had several mistresses, I think.
One during the war, one, yeah. Mm. I don't think it was quite one every book, though.
No. I mean, I don't know how many... a lot of women. I mean, I don't know how many Mrs. David had, but I'm sure it was, I think it was easily 20, maybe 25 or so. None of them, I think, simultaneous, but serial. Right up to the end. I mean, the last person I know that he became very involved with was more than 50 years younger than him. He was in his 80s by this time. She was married with small children, but she said to me, "He's the most important man in my life, even after his death. This is the most important relationship I've ever had." It's very striking.
And talking about the relationships that shape him and ultimately shape the work, I mean, can you talk a little bit about his father and also perhaps how he talked about his father?
Well, his father and his mother. I mean, he came from a very dysfunctional background. In fact, he liked to quote Graham Greene, saying that an unhappy childhood is part of the asset balance of a novelist, and some such phrase. It often, no one's actually been able to quite find that quotation, and maybe David made it up, but it's something like that. His father was a con man on a colossal scale who spent 2 terms in prison and cheated people out of their life savings again and again, and left behind a string of unpaid bills. They would live their lives. David grew up in a household where some of the time they lived like millionaires, and then the Rolls Royce would be parked around the back of the house, or the Bentley. No, it was a Bentley usually, around the back of the house. Angry tradesmen would arrive. Some of the furniture would be taken away, and the schoolmaster would complain. The headmaster would complain that the school fees hadn't been paid, and eventually the Rozzers would come and arrest his father. He'd be taken away in a van and disappear for a year or so. But perhaps even more important than his father was the absence of his mother. His mother disappeared in the middle of the night when he was 5 years old without announcing that she was going. And this left a tremendous scar, I think, on David and on his brother, who was 2 years older. They were like Peter Pan's lost boys. They didn't, "Where's my mother?" And whenever David said that when he was a little boy, whenever a woman came to the house, and quite a lot of women came to the house, he would sidle up to her and say, "Are you my mother?" He didn't know his mother, and in fact he didn't meet her again until he was an adult and sought her out, and then was rather horrified to find that rather than the young woman he expected, she was by then middle-aged. And he was very disappointed in what he found. But it was a childhood where he formed the view that women couldn't be trusted. Women are the enemy was the expression he used. And of course, what do you do to the enemy? You try and get the enemy before they get you. So I think he kind of felt entitled to treat women badly because his mother had abandoned him, which of course is a terrible, awful thing to feel. But that was a sort of crude way of perhaps explaining his psychopathology.
Okay, well, before we do some questions, let's do Honourable Schoolboy, because
yes,
it is so important to us. So, his career has taken off with The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. That's the breakthrough book, right? And then how many books is it before he does Tinker Tailor?
Well, there are 2 or 3 follow-up books to The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and then he tries to break away from spy writing and writes a book called The Naive and Sentimental Lover, his only non-spy book, which is a critical and disaster and to some extent a commercial disaster.
Right.
And he decides instead to return to spy writing, battered, and writes one of his best books. It is a triumphant return, A Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. And this is the first of what was intended to be a much longer sequence. He envisaged it at first rather like a Dance to the Music of Time, or a sequence of maybe 10 or more novels, which would tell the story of the Cold War, but particularly from the perspective of his sort of anti-hero, George Smiley. George Smiley is the antithesis. I'm sure you all know who George Smiley was, but he is, it's worth dwelling on him for a moment. He's the sort of antithesis of James Bond. He's plump, he's not at all athletic, he's middle-aged, or indeed late middle-aged. He has a wife who's unfaithful to him. He's in no sense, and he's not interested in fast cars or anything like that. Very rarely handles a weapon. And what he has is great humanity, and always a sympathy for the people on the other side, and always an understanding of how it would be possible to choose a different way, even for his arch enemy, Carla. The Russian spy master known as Carla. So this sequence of novels that was intended to be much longer actually is 3 novels: Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, The Honourable Schoolboy's the middle, and the final one is called Smiley's People. And The Honourable Schoolboy, as it were, takes up the story immediately after Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, when the whole of the Secret Intelligence Service, which he calls the circus, has been thrown into disarray by the revelation that there was a mole right at the centre of it, a man called Bill Hayden, who is pretty closely modelled on Kim Philby.
And then the interesting thing as well with Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, he really does, that adds to his bank account in a big way as well. So when he decides that he wants to do Honourable Schoolboy and he's thinking about Asia, he actually comes and does the research in Hong Kong. So he's in Hong Kong twice, in 1974 and 1975. He stays at the Mandarin Oriental. He makes friends with the general manager there. And so when we read that book, all of those locations, Jerry Westerby, the occasional that is sent to Hong Kong to look into the question of how the KGB may be funneling money to a Chinese businessman. All of those locations suddenly come there. The Captain's Bar, the FCC, Happy Valley Racecourse, the cricket at Chater Gardens, Statue Square. I mean, all of those, the mid-levels, all of those locations are there. And he's walked the territory in this book, right? And also, of course, it comes out as, I mean, Tinker Tailor is what, 250 pages at most? But I mean, Honourable Schoolboy is 600 pages, right? It's the chunkiest book he wrote, right?
I don't know. The Night Manager is actually very long, but I haven't actually totted them up. But it certainly is quite a long book, and some people think it's too long. That said, I mean, I think it's an extraordinarily vivid. It actually opens in Hong Kong. It opens at the Foreign Correspondence Club.
The Foreign Correspondence Club, which at that time was Sutherland House, not the Lower Albert Road one. As a typhoon is coming into the colony. Yeah.
Where Paul took me yesterday. And it has a very extraordinarily vivid. In fact, Paul has himself written about the agent who's at the centre of it, Jerry Westerby's walk through Hong Kong, and how vividly he evokes the feeling of Hong Kong at that time, which of course is the time before the handover, but there is a sense that this is the end times.
The clock is running.
The clock is running, but and in a wider sense, it's also Westerby travels through Southeast Asia. He shuttles backwards and forwards to Bangkok and then into Cambodia and Laos, and this is at the time when the dominoes are falling, when communist insurgents are preparing to take over, when in Phnom Penh most of the foreigners have left and only a few Europeans remain, and there's constant shelling. It's under siege by the Khmer Rouge insurgents. So and you get a tremendously vivid sense of Southeast Asia in turmoil, in a period of change. Yeah. I mean, I think it's arguably a novel partly about the Vietnam War and about the collapse of Western influence in Southeast Asia.
And also a book about the Sino-Soviet disputes. I mean, and a period piece when he goes to the old Bank of China building, which is still there, of course. He describes it as draped with Cultural Revolution. You can see pictures of that, because that was kind of Communist Party central at that point, the Bank of China, because they'd nationalized it. So it's a very vivid snapshot of the colony at that time, and what's going on in China. Yes, it's the Vietnam War. Yes, Cambodia is about to explode, but we're also in the last 2 years of the Cultural Revolution during that book, and that sense of it comes through as well, about what's going on just over the border.
So I think he not only vividly describes the place, but he also captures the moment in time, and that's Le Carré at his best, as the Spy Who Came In From the Cold, for example, captured the crisis around Berlin, and the central theme of The Spy Who Came From the Cold is the Berlin Wall. Yeah. The book opens at the wall and closes at the wall, which was such a symbol of the division between East and West at that time in the early 1960s. In fact, shortly before its publication, President Kennedy himself flew to Berlin and inspected the wall and made his famous speech about being a Berliner. Yeah. So,
did you have a sense from him? I mean, that why he chose to go to Asia for that book, when his stomping ground before and often later until the end of the Cold War was always sort of Berlin and the divided Europe. Why was it to do with what he was seeing the Americans up to and the American taking over of that region from British power before?
Well, American power collapsing though after the defeat. It's perhaps good to remind ourselves what a tremendous what a surprise it was, and how what a blow it was to American prestige, the loss in Vietnam and those terrible scenes.
But what I mean is the Americans definitely now seeing that as their sphere of influence. So this whole thing, the agreement that Hong Kong is British controlled, the Americans should keep out. I mean, that's all falling apart.
Well, maybe so, but certainly it was a place where the attention of the world had focused, rather as in the early 1960s it might have been Berlin. It was this part of the world perhaps in the mid-70s, and he had a knack for doing this. Later on he writes The Little Drummer Girl about Israel and Palestine, and The Little Drummer Girl still seems to me very relevant. I mean, what he describes is what we're living with now in that part of the world. So he had that ability to see what was going to be important. Much later when he wrote Our Game, he was writing about the areas then known very little in the West of the former Soviet Union in the Caucasus, And he described, in fact, how his American publishers said, Chechnya, where's that? Never heard of Chechnya. And 6 months later, the news was dominated by Chechnya. We've now perhaps forgotten it again, but it was he was there first, as it were.
Okay, we've got 15 minutes left. Someone was going to, for questions, someone was going to take this microphone and walk around with it. Who was that? So if you could wait for the microphone, because they're recording it, so, they want to get that. And if we can, hopefully, if there's a lot of questions, hopefully we can be fairly rapid with the questions, so the answers can be longer than the questions, if you know what I mean.
So if you put your hands up and then,
Reading about John le Carré, it struck me that, unlike his father, who betrayed everybody, John le Carré was actually a reasonably decent human being. Apart from his affairs, he looked after his very extended family, went in for various philanthropic enterprises, and I believe did a great deal for the local community in Cornwall. Was this in some ways another way of reacting to his father?
Well, I think he was a better man than his father, but that's not saying very much. His father was a very bad man indeed. As one of his father's associates said, "We was all bent, David, but your dad was very bent indeed." No, I mean, I think David knew that he was a very damaged person, but he also had a sense of morality, and he often used the analogy. He said, "I'm the bridge that my sons must walk over, in order to have healthy, balanced lives, to be proper human beings." And a lot, that this is in his fiction too. This thing about how to be a decent human being. I mean, that's very much Smiley is agonizing. Is it worth it? What about the suffering of particularly innocent people or vulnerable people, perhaps for a greater cause, but nevertheless each individual mattered to Smiley, and I think to David.
I'm curious whether you read le Carré differently at this end of the project and the encounter, and whether you think your readers will.
That's an interesting question. That hadn't occurred to me before. I think I've just reread, prior to coming here, The Honourable Schoolboy, and I did find it a much better novel than I had remembered. And I suppose I hadn't read it for a long time. I found it it is a very complex story, and it's quite long, as Paul mentioned. And I think some people get bogged down in it, and probably I did before. I don't know if I read the books differently, though. I mean, I was a strong admirer of his work before I met David and embarked on this project, and I remain a strong admirer of his work, by which I mean his best work. Some of his later work, I think, is pretty indifferent, if not really downright bad.
Is there any other question?
Adam, there was a wonderful character called Dick Hughes, who used to trot around the FCC, who I believe was either MI5 or MI6. Did the name ever come up in any conversation with you?
Oh yes, and you'll find there's some discussion of Dick Hughes in Old Crow, as he is in. We've been talking about, Paul and I have been talking about him, mentioned him only this morning. He has the distinction of appearing not just in le Carré's work, but in Ian Fleming's work, possibly the only crossover character, because there's not much similarity between them otherwise. Yeah, but no, various characters of David's are based on real people, and Old Crow is definitely based on Dick Hughes. Yeah.
So Lee's Worth, or good old Lizzie Worthington.
Yes. Yes, I have, I think, definitively identified Lizzie Worthington, who is a key character in The Honourable Schoolboy, who was a mistress of David's and who you can read about in this book.
You mentioned that his later work was not as good, and you, I think in a previous talk, said you wish he'd stopped writing. Do you think you would feel the same way if it was a different writer starting out on their career, and so you haven't got the comparison with his earlier successes? And also I understand his son's now kind of taken up the mantle and he's writing novels in the style of Jean le Carré. Have you read those books, and how do they compare?
Well, to answer the second bit of your question first, I mean, yes, Nick Cornwell, the son of the second marriage, who I know has written so far, well, there's one book that's been published and there's another one coming and more planned. I mean, I have very mixed feelings. I mean, actually, I think he's done a pretty good job. In some ways, his Le Carré is better than late Le Carré, but that said, I'm not sure it's a good idea for Le Carré to become a franchise. I mean, in my opinion, John le Carré was a serious writer, worthy of serious comparison with the best, with major novelists like, say, Graham Greene. He's not someone to be franchised like Ian Fleming. But that's just my personal opinion, and you know, I'm not involved in the decision. As for what you said about the first part of your question, I mean, no, I just think the later books are weak. I mean, what tends to happen is he tends to proselytize. I mean, for me, the odd thing is I rather agree with many of the things that he proselytizes about, but I don't want to be lectured. The moral ambiguity of the best books is to me much more appealing than the kind of the preaching of the later books. I mean, I went on the same second vote marches, of second vote on the EU referendum that he did. I agreed with a lot of the causes, but I didn't want to be lectured about them. And you get a kind of hectoring tone coming in those later novels, which isn't true to life. It isn't the way people really relate to each other or talk to each other. It's as if he's got a message to convey, and he's determined to convey it. Even one of the books that he's most regarded for, The Constant Gardener, isn't, in my opinion, a very good book. It's a really good film, but it's not a very good novel.
Any more questions? I'm going to ask one that you can answer very quickly. Sorry, I'm going to ask. It's a two-part question, but you can answer it quickly. One is, do you think he'll be read in 50 years, 100 years, or do you think he'll drop off the map now that he's gone, even though there's television and all the rest of it? And secondly, did he give you an indication, like, what's a John le Carré reading list? Like, if I want to know where le Carré was, what was he reading?
I don't know is the answer. He wasn't. I mean, what were his influences? Do you mean what were his influences?
Did he look to Conrad?
Yeah, he did look to Conrad. He did look to Greene. Yes, he didn't read much contemporary fiction. He didn't mix in literary circles. He wasn't very clubbable. He did encourage young writers, Nicholas Shakespeare, for example, but he wasn't part of the literary scene. As for whether he'll be still read in 50 years, well, will anybody read anything in 50 years? I sometimes think, I mean, I've got a teenage stepson who is pretty bright, doesn't ever read anything. I mean, really doesn't. And I worry about the future of fiction. But I think that, for example, if people want to know about, in 50 years' time, what was the Cold War, you couldn't do better than read The Spy Who Came In From the Cold.
Which is on the Australian school list for when they study the Cold War.
Apparently so, yes. and quite rightly. But I mean, as I say, looking back in time, I think if people want to understand these times, if they want to understand the 1970s and they want to understand the decline of British power, all of these will be in Le Carré and made perhaps a permanent value by the sort of the moral ambiguity, by the character of George Smiley at the centre of it, the humanity in his characters.
And just finally, because we're told to wrap up, can we just come back to you? What are you doing next? You've done the Asa Briggs biography, which you can mention to encourage us all to find out who he is, or to remember who he was. But what's your next subject?
All suggestions welcome. I've been struggling to find a new subject, and so far, I mean, one of the problems about writing a biography is it's not just up to you; it's up to other people, particularly contemporary biography. I mean, it's I have written books about people long dead, and in a way, it's much easier to write about them. It's quite interesting about the advantages and pros and cons of writing about a living person or a person very recently dead. In many ways, it's, of course, it's a great advantage to be able to consult your subject and to be able to ask them questions and to be able to be directed by them towards certain sources. But it's not as much of an advantage as you might think, because often they've got their own version of their past, which may not be entirely accurate and certainly is party pre. There are all sorts of problems writing about living or recently dead people, interference, indeed more than that, and so if you're writing about people who are long dead and out of copyright, then you can choose your subject.
Okay, so I hope that they've got the full biography upstairs. I haven't looked. They certainly have The Secret Life. They do have it upstairs. Great. So you can buy 2 books. You can buy more than 2 books because they've got lots of books up there. Unfortunately, I don't think they've got The Honourable Schoolboy, but that's easy enough to find. So the bookshop, by the way, is upstairs and then through the back. So please do visit that. There's lots and lots of events going on over the next, till the 15th, that you can obviously come to. But this was Adam Sisman and John Le Carré, and I'd like to thank you all for coming. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you. And if you want to know more about Adam Sisman's biographies, he will be speaking at the University of St. Joseph, the Isla Verde campus, right out there in the sticks, I'm afraid, on Wednesday the 11th at 6:30, about his new biography of Asa Briggs, who actually had a lot to do with Hong Kong, China, and particularly with education and culture in Macau. He was very involved in establishing the University of East Asia in the late 70s and 80s, just part of a very, very long and active life, but something that had a big impact on Macau. And then on Friday the 13th at 7 o'clock, Adam will be speaking about being the craft of biography and the various biographies that he has written. So you do have an opportunity to see and hear more of him in his time in Macau. So please come. These are open public lectures. Everybody is welcome.